Go ahead and get started now. Again, this quarter, we're still studying about the places where Jesus visited or lived. And this week, we're going to continue our study on Jerusalem. We talked about Jerusalem last week. The city of Jerusalem was very central to the Jewish life in the first century and also during the Old Testament, and also was, one of the locations of some of the most significant events from the life and ministry of Jesus. Last week we looked at Luke. In Luke it recorded 3 times where Jesus went to Jerusalem: when he was an infant, when he was 12 years old, and the last time he went was when he was an adult, when they went up to celebrate the Passover, and that was when he was crucified. And it was interesting talking about Jerusalem. The Gospel of John mentions that Jesus went to Jerusalem 4 times. But when you look at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it only shows where Jesus visited Jerusalem 1 time. And that was during the last week of his life there. Now, more than likely, though, he did visit many, many times, because I remember last week it said when he was up to 12 years old, he went there every year because of his parents went there to celebrate the Passover. And with all the Jewish festivals that they had, the 3 Jewish festivals each year, it's more than likely that Jesus has been to Jerusalem many times, even though it's not recorded here in the Gospels. And of course, we know that when we read over in John, it talked about all the things that Jesus did are not in the book. We know that, but it's only recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that he'd been there 1 time during his adult life or during his ministry. Now, Jerusalem is mentioned 660 times in the Old Testament, 130 times in the New Testament. And it was, a very sacred place. It's where it was the city of God. It was the home of the temple. It was the city of Israelite, or the center of Israelite worship. So this week, the reading is from Matthew, and it records where Jesus travels up to Jerusalem. And this is, again, the last time he will travel up to Jerusalem, and also to some of the events that happened during the week of the Passover leading up to Jesus' death. So we'll go ahead and get to our announcements real quick here. Do we have anyone to mention on the sick list? Of course, Carl and Emily have their baby on Thursday. Friday or Thursday? The 2nd. That was Friday, wasn't it? Okay, you're right. I knew you were right. But this Friday you had, okay. She had it. How about that? But anyway.
Motor vehicle accident Friday night. She was going home from Bowling Green. She lives out 185, and she and her son were banged up, bruised up, but the couple that hit them died. They hit them head on. So a lot of emotions going on when you walk in the room. Elizabeth and Saul. Yes, Elizabeth is Nancy Stewart, who used to attend here when she was young. Jeannie Taylor, Ed, Tom. Elizabeth is Nancy's daughter.
Okay. Is Tom Taylor's granddaughter?
Niece.
Tom
Taylor, our elder.
Yeah, Tom.
Yes, Tom Taylor, our elder.
Yeah.
Yes, his granddaughter.
Okay. Yeah. We were eating tonight. I remember someone saying something about that morning and being closed down, and I didn't know what had happened, but I heard about that. Yeah, continue to remember that. That's tough for everyone there involved. Anyone else? Sean?
Hospice over last hospice house, which has kind of helped manage a little bit. They can manage pain medicine there and everything. He's kind of bedbound, and when he comes out of his medicine, he's pretty, he still talk to you, they're pretty good, but he didn't synthesize medicine very well, but he doesn't need enough. So they kind of, when he gets in pain, it's almost like they overdose him to the point of he just sleeps it off. He just doesn't process it as well as some people. So he'll go from one day being pretty talkative and being able to talk to you, till the next day just sleeping all day. So.
And Sean Day is Doug's person now. I've known Doug since I I guess I've been alive, so. He's a good man. Anyone else?
Mark,
Oh, I'm sorry, Brandy.
Brandon still recovers from her hand surgery and everything. She's got arthritis with that in her hands and neck and shoulders and stuff. So she's still in some pain, but I'd like for her to be put back on the long-term prayer list. Please continue with her.
Yeah. Continue to remember Fran, our hand to rest. Again, it's good to see Keith here this morning. It's been a few weeks since he's been here. Anyone else? I didn't look at. Who's reading? Oh. Oh, there you are.
Let us pray. Oh, Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and thank you for all your many blessings. Be with us now as we study a portion of your word. May we take it to heart and apply it to our everyday lives and live a life that's good in your sight. Be with the ones that are sick, the ones that are lost loved ones, and the ones that are facing upcoming procedures. Be with the sick and the shut-ins and all the soldiers overseas. First in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, I'll start to reading from Matthew 20, starting with verse 17. Now Jesus, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples aside on the road and said to them, Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and deliver him unto the Gentiles to mock and scourge and to crucify, and on the third day he will rise again. And Matthew 23:37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and the stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till the day, till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now back to Matthew 21. Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who had bought and sold in the temple, and overturned tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, It is written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. Then the blind and lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. Said to them, Yes. And he said to them, Do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, Yes. Have you never read, Out of the mouth of babes and the nursing infants, you have perfected praise. And then he left him and went out into the city of Bethany, and he lodged there.
Thanks, Darrell. A lot different than it was last week. I think we had like 40 verses last week. But again, there's still quite a bit of stuff in here. But yeah, like I said earlier, it's likely that Jesus visited, Jerusalem several times over his lifetime. But this reading today is the only place in Matthew that we see where Jesus had visited Jerusalem. And, the timeline of the lesson today is, Jesus' earthly ministry is coming to an end. He spent the last 3 years preaching his message, performing miracles, healing the sick, raising the dead, and his popularity is at an all-time high. And he and his followers are going up to Jerusalem. This is, prior to the Palm Sunday, or the day when he makes his, when he rides into Jerusalem on the donkey there. And they're going up there to celebrate the Passover. And, Jesus, going up there, he knows this is going to be his last trip to Jerusalem. His earthly ministry is getting ready to end here. And, all the prophecies of the Old Testament that's been prophesied for him, for the years preceding this, are about to be fulfilled. So that's where we're at sort of here in the text today. And so again, we'll go ahead and we'll get started here. We've got not a lot of reading here today, but there's a lot of content in here. So hopefully, again, please feel free to comment at any time today, because again, this is one of those lessons you sort of you prepare for, but you realize probably there's some things that you pick up on it that other people will probably pick up a lot differently and probably have a lot better commentary on it than I will. So let's go ahead and get started. What were Joshua's first conquests when he led Israel to Canaan? Yeah, Jericho, Ai, Bethel. And, it's one that I think that where this lesson, where this question come from, when you read all this. But like last week, we talked about, Jerusalem. And again, this is what we're studying right now, all about Jerusalem. And, the first time we see where it was mentioned in the Bible, or even maybe where we perceived it was mentioned, when they talked about Melchizedek being the first high priest, the king and the high priest from Salem, and Salem is thought to be Jerusalem. But when we read here, and I was reading too, I don't think Jerusalem is actually specifically mentioned in the books of Moses, the first 5 books of Moses, even though Jerusalem is mentioned by name. It may refer to it as Zion. Again, referred to it there as Salem. But again, as far as it being actually mentioned in the first 5 books, it's not. And really the first place it's mentioned is here, where we're talking about now, when the children of Israel are coming into the promised land. And of course, the first place they conquered there was Jericho. And you think when they hit the promised land, that was the only place that they had to, when they walked around Jericho for 7 times the 7th day, and the walls fell, and they basically, God handed it over to them, and they just had to walk in there and just just destroy everything. That was the end of the story. But it wasn't, because there were still many different kings, many different cities that had to be destroyed by the Israelite nation. So in all, they destroyed some, 30. I think it's 31 cities, or 31 kings, 33 cities that they destroyed there. But it's interesting here. I'm going to jump back here to Joshua 10, chapter 10, just for a second, and read. This is the first time that Jerusalem, I think, is actually mentioned outside, specifically mentioned in the Bible here. And I may be wrong on that, but it says there in chapter 10, it says, Adonizek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured and completely destroyed Ai and his king, and killed his king, and he had destroyed the town of Jericho and killed his king. He also learned that the Gibeonites had made peace with Israel and were now their allies. He and his people became very afraid when they heard that all this was because Gibeon was a large town, as large as the royal cities and larger than Ai. And so the Gibeonite men were strong warriors. So what's happening here is, the Jerusalem king, the Gibeonites were a group of people who actually were the neighbors of the children of Israel, but they came to them and tricked them. They told them they were from a far land, so they made a peace treaty with them. They were, and then they found out sometime later that they actually were their neighbors there. They went to them and they said, why did you make a peace treaty? And they said, well, because of you were large, so they had to honor that. So when the king of Jerusalem found out that they saw what was happening here, they decided they was going to attack the Gibeonites. And so he got like 5 of their, like a little coalition to go in there and attack them. And when they went to attack them, the Gibeonites sent message to Joshua, and Joshua and the children of Israel came down and attacked them and destroyed defeated the king of Jerusalem there. So this is the first time Jerusalem is actually mentioned. So we see that Jerusalem was a settled city there when the children of Israel had left the promised land there around 1500 BC. So question number 2. sometimes you think, why'd you even go into all that? Because when you got these questions we have here, you got some of these questions like one answer, 1 second, one word answer, so you had to sort of fill in the blank, fill in the time slot somewhere there. Question number 2. What people did David and his men conquer to take Jerusalem? Jebusites? Yeah, okay. Yeah. The Jebusites are who were they? They were a Canaanite tribe who inherited Jerusalem before Israel had conquered it. It says this happened here during the 7th year of the reign of David. So, until then it wasn't under Israel control until David captured it, after he'd been king for, several years there. And of course, it became known as the city of David. It became home of David and also became home of the temple later on. And it said, what is the approximate height of Jerusalem above sea level? 2,500 feet, yeah. And I think we had this discussion, one time, but a lot of times when they talk about Jerusalem, they talk about going up to Jerusalem, and when you're looking at a map and you're like, wait a second, it's east or west or south or whatever, and how are you going up to Jerusalem? Well, they're talking about in the Old Testament, and we had this discussion, I think Dolores brought this up one time, she was talking about a map, and someone looked it up and said, when they talk about going up, it means they're going up to Jerusalem. That's the way they sort of, because it was such a high elevation there, which made it, a great advantage for, to be a city there, because it's geographical location. Question number 4. In what direction are the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea from Jerusalem? East, yeah. East, and again, what's the significance of the Jordan Valley? I mean, of course, that's where the Jericho was, but the elevation of it was, there's no elevation. It's actually 1,300 foot below sea level. So, again, you got Jerusalem up here at 2,500, and within 20 miles to the east of it, you go all the way down to 1,300 feet. So about a 3,800 foot decline there in just a short. And that's one of the things they always talk about going up to Jerusalem there. It's always interesting too. The Dead Sea. That's it's below sea level, but also too we talked about the Sea of Galilee last week. It's also below sea level too. But it's a freshwater sea there. But again, it's those two seas there. It's interesting how they are below sea level. Question number 5. After the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi, how many times did Matthew and Mark say Jesus warned his disciples of what was to happen to him in Jerusalem? 3 times, yeah. 3 times. And backing up here, this is, we're all familiar with this. We studied this a few quarters ago about when Jesus came to his disciples there at Caesarea Philippi, and he asked them, he said, who do you think that I am? And some of them said, we think that some say that you are John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, some say a prophet. And that's when Jesus asked the disciples specifically, he said, but who do you say that I am? And that's when Peter made the confession, you are the Jesus Christ. And again, we see there that the people, that the apostles there, or the ones that are following Jesus, or the disciples, they're just starting to get a glimpse of who he is. It's not something that through his teaching and stuff they all understood. And they're starting to comprehend somewhat, or I'm sorry, starting to understand, but they still just they don't comprehend who Jesus is. So when Jesus made that, when Peter confessed to all the disciples there that Jesus was the Son of God, and Christ up on this rock I'll build my church, 3 times after that, he warned them about he was going to go up to Jerusalem and be killed. And these warnings he had, they're both in Matthew and Mark together. They're the same warnings in Matthew is also in Mark. And so if you look there in Matthew 16, this is the first time Jesus tells his followers that he's going to be killed. He says, he explained to them that the older Jewish leaders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the law would make him suffer many things. He told his followers that he must be killed. Then on the third day he will be raised from the dead. He told them that in Matthew 16, and that's also in Mark 8. Also in Matthew 17 and Mark 9, and this is Mark's reading, this is the second time that he told them this. He said he wanted to teach his followers alone. He said to them, the Son of Man will be handed over to the control of other men who will kill him. And after 3 days he will rise from the dead. But the followers did not understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him. So we see there's 2 times here, and then again in today's reading, as they were going up to Jerusalem for the 3rd time, there's 3 times here that Jesus actually tells his followers, his disciples, what's going to happen to him. He's going to go up, he's going to be killed, and still even after he was crucified, even when Jesus was, of course, the night they were in Gethsemane, Peter defended him, but then after that, you never saw anything of the disciples besides John, and the rest of them sort of, because they thought Jesus was going to be the Messiah. He was going to be the one that delivered them from the Israelites there. So even we saw too, like a couple weeks ago, when we talked about Emmaus, we were talking about the road to Emmaus, the people that Jesus talked to on the way back. When Jesus came up to him, he joined the conversation. What was their conversation? They said the Messiah had been killed. He had died, and they thought he was going to be the great Messiah. They thought he was going to deliver them from the Romans there, but then and the Romans and also the Jewish hierarchy. But then they find out that he had died, and they also mentioned too that they went to the tomb, and the tomb was empty, and they still did not understand. After they'd been told 3 times here prior to his death, and basically this was just a week or 2 before as they're going up to Jerusalem, and they still did not understand. They couldn't comprehend what Jesus' message was or what his mission was here on earth. Any comments? Okay. Question number 6. Who were some of the men generally identified with Jesus? Yeah. And I didn't know what they was asking for that question. I sort of wrote what you wrote down too about Jeremiah, Elijah, and the prophets. You almost had, it wasn't actually in our lesson, I don't think. Maybe it was, but yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Yeah, I think it was mentioned. A lot of times when they ask a question in this book, it's pretty simple, straightforward. It's it's like in the first paragraph, all 10 questions. But that one was not there. But I wrote down too. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, the other prophets. That's who the people thought Jesus, who they identified, who he was, in the Old Testament, that who he may, when they look back at the Old Testament, so that's who they identified him with.
I read that question different.
Did you?
Well, just because it said, who are some of the people?
Yeah.
Men generally identified with Jesus. I didn't mean like who is identified with, but I just thought it was like they were always saying he was tax collectors and sinners. That's what I was saying.
And that could be this too, because again, usually when he writes a question, whoever this author is, it's pretty straightforward. And that was one of those that you write on they already did. And that's when you read these questions. Sometimes you can get embarrassed sometimes when you read this and you're like, and you get up here like, that's not what I thought I read 14 times I read it before I walked up here today, and all of a sudden if you read it, you're realizing that you read it in a different way. All those are great answers though. Question number 7. How many long teachings of Jesus did Matthew preserve? 5, yeah. And some of these questions you wonder I think the significance of this question, he's going back to the second text there in Matthew 23, and some of these long teachings are basically what they call long sermons. He gave some examples there. Matthew 5 through 7, we all know that's the Sermon on the Mount, and then Matthew 10, 13, Matthew 18, and then here in Matthew 23. And I think the point of this here too is to understand when Jesus is talking about, he's saying this, oh Jerusalem, we have to go back up and read, what happened in the context before this. So if you look at the first 23, chapter 23, the first, 36 verses, we're not going to read this, but basically, to summarize it, You know, Jesus is criticizing the Jewish leaders here. You know, he starts in chapter 3 by pointing out that they had the authority to teach the law. They had the authority to teach the law of Moses. But he's pointing out their authority, he points out their actions and said it was all for show. When they were teaching, you know, they were just, you know, they weren't genuinely faith. You know, they lacked faith. You know, it wasn't genuine what they were doing. And then he delivered 7 woes, or he delivered 7 condemnations in this reading here, these verses, warning them against their hypocritical behavior. He warns them that they're going to face judgment. So he goes to these first, you know, 35 verses or 37 verses, you know, criticizing the leaders there in Jerusalem, you know, and for all the things that they were doing, for all the hypocrisy that they were going through. And then in verse 37, you know, Matthew 23 says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, You know, when you read that, you know, it just shows Jesus' you know, how he was agonizing over this. You know, when you think about this, it sort of reminds you of David and his son Absalom. You remember? And he said, "Oh Absalom, oh Absalom." What did Absalom try to do to David? Try to kill him, you know. And it was his own son. He tried to kill him, and even when Absalom, he found Absalom had died, he said, "Oh Absalom, oh Absalom." He mourned. It was just, you know, it was something that he didn't want to happen. And this is the same way Jesus says when you read this. He says, "Oh Jerusalem, oh Jerusalem." You know, think of all the bad things that Jerusalem had done. You know, they're getting ready to reject him. They're getting ready to crucify him. They're getting ready to do all the things that they have done. And yet Jesus is mourning over Jerusalem just like David mourned over his own child to die there. And that's when you read that, you know, and it says, "I wanted to gather you and to comfort you." And you know, he just, you know, what Jesus wanted to do for Jerusalem and what Jerusalem did for Jesus was two different opposite things. You know, Jesus wanted to, you know, to be like a mother hen, or God, you know, to take care of them. Yet they didn't allow that to happen. Okay, question number 8. What is the formula statement with which Jesus closed the long teaching sections? What is the formula statement with which Matthew closed the long teaching sections of Jesus? What's that? Morning of Jude, yeah. Yeah, again, I'm not sure what that. I put when he, you know, all those statements. There's if you go back and read all 5 of those long sermons, there's like a statement. It says something like, "And when Jesus had finished," or "Now when it came to pass." Again, I'm not sure what but I guess I'm not sure what that question is all about. So we'll just skip past that one. How much time did it pass between Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on a donkey and his crucifixion? 1 week, yeah. Actually, you know, back up here. Let's go back to this too. I think that the book, it said a week there, but you know, the book last time I taught, there was a couple of errors in there, and I think this is another error in the book too, because you know, when Jesus came into the city on the donkey, that was on Palm Sunday. Then, of course, and we'll just go through the events of Jesus' life real quick. And that was Palm Sunday when he came. We call it Palm Sunday, but, you know, the reason they call it Palm because they laid the palm branches down. He rode upon them on the donkey. But that was on Sunday. Monday was when he went to the temple and when he cast everyone out. Tuesday was when he basically went back to he did some teaching, but he also went back to the teachers. That's when they confronted him. Wednesday, he didn't. Basically, there's not a lot of events that happened that day. That's when Judas decided to betray him. Then Thursday was when the events happened at the Last Supper. You know, they went to the Garden of Gethsemane, the prayer. Then throughout the night, you know, then the next morning was when he was arrested during the night. Then on Friday, he was crucified and put in the grave. So really, from Friday to Sunday was when that happened. So I think the question the time between his Jerusalem on his donkey and his resurrection will be in 7 days, but his crucifixion will be in 5 days. So, because he was crucified on Friday and then he rose on again on Sunday. Yeah, I don't know. I read that question. I thought either he put the something was not right about that question, but it should have been 5 days between the time he rode into Jerusalem and the time he was crucified, and then 7 days between the time he rode in the resurrection. So, okay. And question number 10: what did Jesus do immediately after his triumphant entry into Jerusalem? Cleanse the temple, yeah. And why did he cleanse the temple? What's that?
They weren't worshiping there, they were selling merchandise.
Right. Yeah, that's, I think
I say because it needed cleansing.
yeah. But it was a house of prayer. What's that? It was a house of prayer, and it wasn't for a place of commerce, And what was happening there, they were exploiting the poor. Money changers. When you came to the temple there, you had to have a temple. I think somebody compares it to the Vatican. They have their own currency now, and I may be totally wrong about that, but anyway. But in the temple, though, they did have their own currency there. So you had to use that currency to buy things there. So when they had the money changers, it's just like nowadays you go somewhere, you don't have money, you don't have places you exchange your money in different countries because your credit cards do it for you. But back years ago, you go somewhere and you look around and they give you different currencies or different amounts, and then they take a little bit of your money. But here, what it was doing, the money changers were taking more, and they were giving you a bad exchange rate, first thing. And also, too, they were forcing them to buy the animals and to sacrifice them. These were the ones that they were forcing them to buy these animals. Now, again, the sacrifices and stuff, that's what Jesus, not Jesus, that's what God had commanded in the Old Testament, the Old Law. They go out and in the minimum sacrifice, well, actually, if you couldn't afford it, I think you could do like bread or something other, but still the minimum sacrifice is like doves, and it depended on what you could afford. So when people wanted to get right with God, they wanted to go into worship the temple, they had to make an animal sacrifice. So this was all, there's nothing wrong with the animal sacrifices or purchasing those things, but it was the way it was being done. Because when I read back on this, Caiaphas was the high priest there, and the high priest has sort of put this into place here that basically you couldn't buy offerings unless you bought them inside the temple there in the courtyard, and so they charged what they wanted to, So it's almost like going to a ball game and you can go buy a whole case or going to an amusement park and buy a whole case of water for $5, but you go into the park and a bottle of water costs you $5, and that's sort of what was happening there, and it was exploiting the poor, and even the price of a dove, said for the 2 doves it might have been up to 2 days' wages to make that sacrifice. And so they were taking advantage of the poor, and this was the high priest. This is Caiaphas. And again, we say, you say, why do they have a problem with Jesus? Yeah, they had a problem with Jesus because he claimed he was the Son of God, but also too, he was cutting into their pocketbooks, and there's other things, other reasons why then that they they wanted to kill Jesus there. That when this all happened, but that's where Jesus, again, selling this stuff, and before that too, people sold it. I read somewhere maybe they sold it at the Mount of Olives before Caiaphas and the high priest took this over. But again, they had just turned it into, like I said, Brian said, a den of thieves. They were just taking people's money and making money off worship which God required for them to do.
He also planned it because he was going to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb, even though it didn't take place in the temple. It was a precursor to his death, where he became the sacrificial lamb. So when it comes to get ready for him,
It may have been, but he was. But again, like I said, there was reasons for it. It wasn't just because he was, just walked in there one day all mad and had a bad morning, because he walked in and just saw what was being done in again, his father's house. Okay. Question number 1, or discussion starters. How did the ancient defenses of Israel, of Jerusalem, play into the history of the city? The elevation, what we're getting back to here, okay? And again, we talked about a while ago, it's, to the east of it was 3,700 feet down to Jericho. It was downhill. you had the Kidron Valley to the right. To the south of it, you had another deep ravine, and to the east. So, geographically, where it was located at, it was pretty well protected on all three sides. The problem was it wasn't protected from where? The north. So when we talk about the Babylonians, when they invaded Israel, they invaded from the north. The Romans invaded from the north. So, but geographically speaking, that's why Israel was such a great place to be at, because of the location was, basically three sides of it was pretty much, by just the location, was a great defensive, it protected it there. Of course, it had good water supply there, and also too, the climate helped it, to grow crops and stuff. So it was, it was a good location. But yeah, again, where it was at there, pretty much the only way you could get to Jerusalem was coming from the north. Question number 2. Why would the contemporaries of Jesus had identified him with several characters from the Old Testament? I just wrote down, he was the promised Messiah. Throughout the Old Testament, you see Jesus in the Old Testament throughout it. So you see different individuals. You see Moses. I think Matthew tried to show where Moses led the children out of Israeli captivity. Matthew's actually trying to say, make the comparison that Jesus is going to lead them out of spiritual bondage. You see, he was David. He was of the line of David. He was so he was fulfilling prophecy. The kingdom of David out of his lineage would become a Messiah. So they were looking at that. So just different people in the Old Testament there that they were comparing him to. And question number 3, why would Jesus have more in the state of Jerusalem instead of a different city? Yeah, it's God's chosen city. It was. What did I write down here? It's where that's where God allowed David to build the temple. The city of David. That was the heart of the nation of Israel. That's where again, and we read too. Back when they talk about the tabernacle or even, the temple, they always thought God was there, his presence was there. That's when they went to there to feel the presence of God, even though, we know that no house could contain God, but his presence was there. So, but the problem here too, and again, I think this goes back to this question we're looking here, the part we read about, oh Jerusalem, the Jewish nation, and when he talks about oh Israel, he's talking about, or oh Jerusalem, he's talking about the whole nation itself. The nation here doesn't understand. They have God in the flesh standing in front of them, and yet they're rejecting him. And even we see where Paul, even in his teachings, they went to the Israelite nation first, and what happened? The Jews rejected him, and they took it to the Gentiles. So, but I think Jesus knew that they were going to have an opportunity for peace and for but yet they chose not. They went down their own path here, and that's why he mourns for them, because again, God wanted to save Jerusalem. I think Jesus wanted Jerusalem to be saved, but again, from the time they left Egypt, they always, for some reason or other, they just never were, seemed like they ever trusted in God or was content on what he was doing for them. And question number 4, which do you suppose to be the case? Jesus cleansed the temple twice in his ministry, or John recorded the temple cleansing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry? Explain your answer. Does anybody have an opinion on that? Well, refresh. What happens here, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus tells this about cleansing the temple, as we read today, in the very last week of Jesus' life. After he came in for the Passover, this was on Monday. If you go back and read in John, it's in the very first part of John. It's right after Jesus had changed the water to wine at the wedding in Cana. And if you read there in verse, that is in verse, the first 11 verses of John 2, and then And in John 2, verse 12, it says Jesus and his mom and his disciples went to Capernaum for a few days. Then verse 13 says they went to the Passover, and verse 14 says he's cleansed the temple. So you got within 3 verses there, Jesus goes from doing the water, changing the water to wine, to actually having the cleansing the temple there. So some people feel like maybe John just sort of stuck it there at the first of it. And maybe, but a lot of people feel like there's 2 different accounts. There Jesus, at the first of his ministry, he went to the temple and cleansed it, and then he went back again and cleansed it at the very last week of his life. So, I guess the question, which side would you go on? And to me, again, this is just me reading. You think chronologically, John may not place it in the right order, because because when you think about it, when he was with his mom there before the wedding, and Mary had asked him to change the water, or didn't ask him to change water to wine, but she asked him, what can we do here? He said, Mom, this is not my problem. My time has not come yet. Now, it may be talking about his ministry, but still, he didn't want to draw a lot of attention. So to be there in the first few verses of John, then 3 or 4 verses later, he's actually in the temple overturning the tables and stuff. That seems a little bit odd. It may have happened, but I'm just saying, that would seem odd. Also, too, you would think if it happened twice, maybe the other synoptic gospels would have mentioned it twice. They wouldn't have just mentioned it one time. So, I think probably it was chronologically out of order, and that's fine. That's what they do. Now, there were some differences there also. If you read in the passage we read today, that the officials didn't confront him to the very next day. If you read in John, they confronted him the same time he did it. So there's different times they confronted him. There's a little different account there. Talked about making a whip, and then made a whip as far as over in John, whereas he didn't tell that in Matthew. But still, sometimes some authors tell it different ways also. So to know, whether he did it the first of his ministry or he did it 3 years later, it's really not a scripture. I mean, it's not a salvation issue at all. But people could argue, and you could argue it both ways. But either way, like I said, the difference, I guess, to point out here, there are 2 different accounts of it, and John tells about this happening at the very first of John, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke tells about it happening during his last week. But other than that, they're pretty similar in their. Right, because again, it happened the very first of John. So you may be right. I hadn't thought about that. Okay. Thank you all.